And I have been thinking about the Conservancy this summer, not just because Ryan asked me to come and say a few words. I am in the process with some old friends of starting a new organization myself this fall, and it's given me occasion to think about the early years of this place, and especially the incredible people who were involved in getting this organization going. I'm not including myself in that list. And when Ryan asked for some vignettes about what the organization was like in those early years, I found myself thinking that really the thing to do is to talk about the people who got the Monadnock Conservancy going and led it in those first years. Now, Ryan's also asked if I could try to keep this to 5 minutes or less, and I'm going to work on being good and not going too egregiously over that limit, which will be tough because the number of people about whom I have really wonderful stories is pretty large, and a lot of them are here in this room. The number of people who are deserving of praise for time and talent sort of given generously and freely is even larger. A bunch of them are in this room, and a bunch of the people who I am very, very fond of is even larger than that. So I'm gonna just touch on a few. And the first person who I would love to talk about and who I know cannot make events like this much anymore, although I hope that her contributions and her efforts are still felt powerfully, even if she is not personally here, is Mary Jane Grasty. And Mary Jane Grasty was one of the founders of the organization. She is a saint in a fallen and messy world. When I started in it as the first employee, our office was a small room in Dennis Liner's optical business over here in Peterborough, and we had a very desirable low post office box number in the Dublin post office. And early on, I went with Mary Jane to a meeting down in New Ipswich to try to revive a land project that had largely stalled out. And this was the kind of meeting that started badly and just went south from there. If memory serves, there was a number of selectmen there. There was a bunch of folks from the planning board, the Conservation Commission, an ad hoc recreational group that I no longer quite remember the standing of, a number of concerned citizens exercising their civic prerogative. And without saying a single disparaging word about any of those highly virtuous groups, there were individuals from those groups who were far more interested in making clear the flaws and shortcomings of the other groups than they were in actually productively accomplishing anything. And I sat in this meeting, and in my mind, I started rolling forward the number of months I thought it would take us to actually get this whole thing done. Early in the evening, I started about 3 or 4 months, and this meeting really went on for an impressively long time. By the end of the meeting, I was thinking, it's going to be 2 or 3 years until we ever get this thing done. And then, in the final 15 minutes of the night, Mary Jane sort of engineered this magic that to this day I do not quite understand and cannot entirely describe to you, except that egos were soothed and grievances were acknowledged and validated, and past contributions that had never been fully appreciated were appreciated, and compromises were brokered, and lions laid down with the lambs, and a babe led them, and somehow we had a deal, and we're scheduling a closing. And I have this incredibly vivid memory of sitting in the room and watching this meeting breaking up, and watching Mary Jane work her way around with that fantastic smile and a kind word for everybody there. I had known coming in that I was an apprentice. I had not fully appreciated the degree to which I was in the presence of a master until that moment. The second person who I want to tell you about was another force in the early days of the organization. And the good news here is that she was a force for good, because she was going to be a force. There was just no question about this. And this was Cecily Bastido, who I'm sure a number of you know. I should say Cecily's consideration of joining this board was impressive. I have been through extensive job interviews. I believe I have been through audits that were less rigorous than Cecily's consideration of the Conservancy. And I think this is in keeping with one theme of Cecily's time and all the work I did with her over the years. You know, if there was something that needed to be done, then by God, she was going to do it right. And I'm not exaggerating at all when I say, if someone here were to tell me that the current board of this organization and the future board members of this organization were going to take that role as seriously with the professionalism and the hard work and the high standards of Cecily Bastido, I would say there is absolutely no challenge you cannot overcome. There is nothing this organization could not do. Now, there's a story I'm not going to tell you, but it's a good one, that is about why everybody here should be grateful to Cecily. Cecily took on the leadership in the very beginning of making this organization adopt the standards and practices of the Land Trust Alliance and ensuring that everything we did was to a professional standard. And of course, now we are accredited. Now we have come even further. But Cecily was the person who first put us on that road. But I'm not going to tell you that story. I'm going to tell you another great Cecily story about how she saved us. After I arrived, we got stuck for a little while. We had decided that we wanted to have one of these newfangled endowment things that other organizations had, and they sure seem spiffy. And we couldn't decide as a board whether we should have an endowment, the principle of which was permanently restricted and managed independently, such that it could not be touched by either board or staff, and the perception and the reality of that durability being important to the sort of long-term prospects of the organization. There was a whole faction of board members who said that is extremely important. And then there was a second faction of board members who said we should have, in effect, an invested reserve, the principle of which we could draw on in times of great need, such as the legal defense of our easements. And each side made its case, and we went around on it for quite a bit, without making much of any progress whatsoever. And then Cecily came along, and you will understand I'm paraphrasing here. Cecily's take on all of this was to the effect of, for God's sakes, people. And with Cecily's leadership, we proceeded to solicit and very gratefully receive gifts for a permanently restricted endowment to be held at the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation from the people who thought that was important. And then we solicited and gratefully received gifts for an enforcement and stewardship fund from the people who thought that was important. And suddenly we had both. And we had, in fact, far more than we would ever thought we'd have back when we thought we were going to have to pick one and promptly alienate 2/3 of the board and our donors. So we have Cecily to thank for all of that. And I have, even in a little packet of stuff did I bring it up with me? I have right here. I have brought, in tribute to Cecily, 2 checks today. One to our endowment at the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation, and one to the Stewardship and Enforcement Fund, as both are important, and in tribute to the woman who made us all see the light on that. The third person I wanted to talk about is somebody who I was personally incredibly lucky to serve with, and that is Diane Schott. Diane, there are a number of things I love about Diane, one of which is that she can communicate more in a skeptically raised eyebrow than any number of people can communicate in paragraphs. And by virtue of Diane being vice president of the board and then head of the Lands Committee, and by virtue of my role, I was frequently the one speaking in somewhat unconvincing paragraphs, and Diane was the one skeptically raising an eyebrow at them. Diane is a woman of tremendous judgment and discernment. And it's helpful to understand that at this time, the Conservancy had done a certain amount of work in the towns right around the mountain, Monadnock, and we had done some work in Hillsborough, in the far sort of southwestern corner of Hillsborough. But if you took Cheshire County and you kind of divided it into 4 quadrants, the 75% of Cheshire County, which was the entire northern half and the entire western half, we had never really done anything in. Keene was kind of the far westernmost frontier beyond which scouts had not yet traveled. We had individual board members and allies and people involved with the organization who had been to all sorts of places, who had lived and worked in Southeast Asia and Europe and Westmoreland. But we as an organization had not actually done anything in most of those towns, and most of the people there had never heard of us because we had never given them reason to hear of us. So I set a somewhat arbitrary deadline for myself, and I said, sort of, in the next 6 months, I'm going to meet with every group of selectmen, every planning board, and every conservation commission of every single town in this area, and I am going to introduce the Monadnock Conservancy and talk a little bit about ourselves. And then I'm going to ask them, what is going on in your town, and is there a role that we can play? Is there something we can do to be helpful? It probably goes without saying I was not dating anyone at the time, so I had a lot of weeknights free. And I set off to do this whole sequence of meetings. And I remember showing up at a particular town hall that had a relatively small room in the back where all the volunteer boards met. It had one folding table and a few folding chairs. And there was almost nothing on the door except a quote that had been clipped out of the newspaper. Not the rest of the article, just this one quote. And it was a quote from Diane. And I do not mean to bring up past traumas or raise the pain of past events, but let's just say that at this point in time, there was a certain situation going on in Jaffrey that involved a Rite Aid, and it had turned into something of a melodrama. And the quote from Diane read, "No phrase should strike such terror in the hearts of a planning board than the words conditional approval," said Diane Schott, co-chair of the Jaffrey Planning Board. And I had this meeting, and I went back to the office, and I was talking to Diane the next day on the phone about it, and she asked me how it went, and I said, I think we are all going to get along fine. I think this is the beginning of some beautiful friendships. And it has been tremendous. After I passed the baton to Dick, I observed a certain moratorium of staying away from the organization, which was made easier by the fact that I was a penniless graduate student in Chicago. As I've come back over the years, it has been wonderful to see how much the Conservancy has grown. And all the people who have taken this on and made it their own organization. I periodically will meet people at this event who are new to me and I am new to them. And they will ask me, so who are you and what's your connection to this place? And I will say to them, well, you know, I'm just another Betsy Harris disciple who got converted to land conservation while I was on the road to something else. You all know Betsy and all the tremendous things about her, and you know enough to have not let her escape the board all these years, which shows tremendous good judgment in all of you. I think of Betsy as somebody who is got tremendous wisdom about not tripping over your own feet, not making things harder for yourself than they need to be, and sort of keeping to what is important, and not muddying the waters with other distractions. And one little example of this, Betsy and I used to work on the newsletter together. We were a two-person committee of the newsletter. And Betsy would be very clear, this is going to surprise you to hear Betsy would be very clear. Betsy would be very clear that the content of the newsletter was going to be well written. It was going to be interesting and meaningful. There was to be absolutely no fluff, thank you very much. And the entire newsletter was going to be concise and to the point enough that you could read the whole thing over a cup of coffee and a muffin. And that was pretty much the sum of our editorial policies. And I have to say they worked extremely well, and they served the organization in fine form for many years. I know a number of you have heard John's great line that he has given to the Monadnock Conservancy the greatest years of his wife. Here's another John story. I'm going to indulge myself just this once. We had a meeting years ago to review the first ever Monadnock Conservancy website, which hadn't existed before. Bob Boynton, wherever you are, sir, thank you. Bob Boynton went back into his woodshed and with spare lumber and whatever else put together a website for us. And a bunch of us got together at night to look at it. John and my suggestion, this was the only thing I contributed to the entire proceedings. Our suggestion was that when people called up the homepage, a great musical score should rise in the background and everyone should hear, "Give us land, lots of land, and the starry skies above. Don't fence us in." John and I thought that was a capital idea. But neither of us were board members, so there was promptly a vote and we were unanimously voted down. So I'm almost done. I will wrap this up by just talking about one last person, and that's Phil, Phil Faulkner. And this group does not need me to say what a tremendous man Phil Faulkner was. I know Rick Church is going to be up here a little bit later. Rick has more experience and authority to talk about this than I do. Phil made a career at Markham of taking, young men and women of dubious merit and helping turn them into actual competent professionals. And this was one of the things he did for me. After we moved the office to Keene, Phil would come by like clockwork every day, 20 minutes after the mail was delivered. I wondered sometime if he had the mailman on some kind of ankle tracker. His timing was impeccable. And we would sit and we would go through the mail and we would see what came in that day. And Phil would dutifully write thank you notes for every single thing that arrived in the mail. And then we would talk about whatever I'd been working on the previous 24 hours. And then Phil would tell some sort of vignette or parable about something that had come up at Markham and the situation and how they dealt with it. And as the years went by, I got better at drawing the through line from Phil's parable to the thing that I was kind of imperfectly working on the previous 24 hours. I wasn't quite as intuitive as I should have been at the beginning. And then we would chat for a while. Phil would leave. He would go first to the bank. He would deposit all the checks. He would go second to the post office and mail all the thank you notes. And then he'd go home to look in on Pat. And it continues to this day to be a source of puzzlement to my wife and periodically of aggravation. That whenever a check arrives in the mail at our house, I am absolutely insistent that it has to be deposited in the bank the same day. Regardless of the hour of day or night, I will not go to bed unless I've seen that that's been taken care of. And I have absolutely no acceptable defense for this behavior whatsoever, except that it is the way I was taught. And it's just the way it is. So I am going to hush up. I'm going to pass over the microphone. I'm also going to pass this envelope to Ryan on one condition, which is that this is deposited in the Monadnock Conservancy's bank account by the end of the day today, without fail, before you go home. So.